When I started out my first podcast, I had to make a lot of decisions on things I knew almost nothing about. One of those choices was which hosting platform to use. On this episode of the Great Big Intergalactic's How to Start a Podcast series, we're going to learn a little more about what a hosting platform actually is, and we'll dive into trying to understand some of the other potentially confusing terminology that often gets used in the world of podcasting.
The Great Big Intergalactic.
This is part 3 of How to Start a Podcast. If you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes, my main guest name is Derrick, and he owns Hindsight 101 Media, which can be found at hindsight101media.com. He's the guy who taught me how to start podcasting, and I'll be asking him some questions that will hopefully help any new podcasters out there to navigate the process of starting your own podcast for the first time. On this episode, we'll be focusing on hosting platforms. And I also spoke with another guest contributor for this one, and his name is Andrew. He's an audio engineer, and he'll be explaining some of the frequently used terminology that you'll need to know when getting into podcasting. But before we go there, I wanted to get into the minds of people who have started their own podcasts, so I reached out to a few content creators to ask what inspired them to start podcasting, how they did it, and what they do differently if they knew in the beginning what they knew now. And this one is from Isaac from Biologic Podcast.
My name is Isaac, and I host the Biologic Podcast. To me, podcasting is a way to explore something that I find really interesting, and to share my perspective with the world. I try, but I can't quite put into words the fascination and wonder that I feel when I look at ecosystems, or cells, or biochemical processes. The movement of animals, the life cycle of plants, the ecology of forests and fungi, the cycle of life, the biosphere, the potential for alien life. It's all amazing to me. I think it's more than beautiful. It's sublime. It's entrancing, enigmatic, even existentially exigent. And podcasting lets me share my enthusiasm for the biological with the world. Also, podcasting is definitely a hobby for me. It's a one-man operation from beginning to end, and sometimes life keeps me busy. But I do what I can, and I enjoy it. It's a kind of creative expression, and it makes me happy. I had a crazy whim to start a podcast. I did a bit of research, and then I jumped in. I don't use anything too complicated. I use a basic Blue Yeti microphone, which is reliable, but it's not cutting edge or anything. I do my sound editing in the free Audacity app, and I do my video editing in the free iMovie app. And all of this is on a personal disconnected OS X desktop. So, like I said, nothing crazy. I do pay a small monthly fee to a web host to set up an RSS feed that gets the show in iTunes. All of these tools have been good enough for my purposes, so I wouldn't change anything in that regard. But if I knew all of this starting out all over again, I would definitely subscribe to the hosting service earlier. Also, I might branch out into a more powerful video editor so that I could add a stronger video element to my podcast on YouTube.
Thank you, Isaac. That was good stuff. Isaac brings up a good topic here. He introduced video into the conversation, which is a subject that I really haven't brought up yet. For me personally, I mostly listen to podcasts during commutes or when I'm hiking or at the grocery store, and none of those environments tend to be friendly towards watching anything. But one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that not everyone consumes content the way that I do, or the way that you do. Just because I don't watch podcasts on YouTube, it doesn't mean that other people don't. A question that I frequently see online is, should I put my podcast on YouTube in addition to the usual podcasting platforms? My response is usually, why wouldn't you put your product in as many places as possible? I think that it's kind of human nature to assume that because we like to consume content in the way that we do, that everyone else consumes it in that manner too. The reality is that not everyone likes to do things the way that we like to do them. So why not give people as many options as possible? That's my personal opinion, at least. I think that another important thing to know is that you don't actually have to have a video on your YouTube channel to be on YouTube. But Derrick from Hindsight 101 has a YouTube channel and a podcast, so I asked him what he thought about adding a video element to your podcast. And here's what he had to say.
There's always a debate around, should my podcast be video or should it be audio only or should it be both? I don't really think you should worry that much about it. So if you're like me, who I started out doing video, so it would have been very easy for me to do video and an audio. And I just, I would record kind of how, again, the Joe Rogan example where he records a video podcast, but then he also takes that audio and makes it an audio podcast. So you get 2 for 1 and you can expand and reach a wider audience. So in that respect, it's good, but video is a lot harder than audio. So there's that cost and learning curve and everything that goes along with it. So if you're first starting out and you know nothing about video, I would really steer clear of it. But if that's something you want to take on or you're experienced in video, I mean, audio is just naturally, because you have to have good audio when you're doing a video. So for me, like, it was a natural transition to do podcasting because I already had the audio background. But if you're new to all of this, I would say I would wait to tackle video and just do audio. But like I said, you can reach a broader audience because some people like to watch, some people like to listen, and you can do the best of both worlds.
Back when I first began trying to figure out how to launch my first podcast, I really struggled to understand some of the frequently used terms that podcasters use because it all seemed so foreign and new to me. DAWs or DAWs, RSS feeds, hosting platforms. I had no idea what any of these things were. And once I figured out what they were, I still had to figure out how they worked and which ones to choose. And there just seemed like there were so many to choose from. So for this episode, I reached out to Andrew, who is an audio editor with a degree in audio engineering who has a passion for education, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Andrew. I'm an audio engineer. I'm trying to educate and empower creators with the knowledge they need to get great podcast audio. You can check out my website, trackeditprint.com, find me anywhere on social media at trackeditprint, or catch me on Reddit at r/podcasting. If you're struggling with something audio related, shoot me a message and I'll see what I can do to help you out.
Okay, I am going to use some of the terms that you might hear when venturing into podcasting, and Andrew has volunteered to explain what each of those things actually mean. All right, Andrew, what is a DAW or DAW?
A digital audio workstation, sometimes called a DAW or DAW, is a generic term for audio editing software that handles multiple files at once. Some examples would be Adobe Audition, Reaper, Audacity, and many others.
Okay, thank you. What is an RSS feed?
RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication. RSS is a way for authors to publish notifications of new content. This content may include articles, blog posts, and podcasts. These RSS feeds contain the links to the hosted media and publishing information such as authors, titles, and dates. They can be subscribed to through software such as Google Podcasts, Spotify, or any RSS reader, and will automatically push new content to your subscribers.
A podcast directory.
A podcast directory is a website or app that collects RSS feed from podcasts, sorts them by category, and makes the index searchable. This makes it easier to find new podcasts. Many directory applications also double as podcast players, letting you subscribe to the RSS feeds and listen to episodes.
And finally, what is a podcast hosting service?
A podcast hosting service is a service that hosts your audio files, creates an RSS feed for them, and delivers the RSS feed to platforms like Spotify and Google Podcasts. Some podcast hosting services offer more features such as analytics or advertisement insertion.
Thank you again, Andrew. Now that we know what a hosting platform is, let's dig into how it all works. I asked Derrick from Hindsight 101 Media to talk a little more about podcast hosting services and why exactly do podcasters need to have one?
There are many types of hosting services that you can house your podcast on. So basically, you have to have a platform somewhere out in the cloud, the internet, that you can save your podcast to, and then they're the home base where they can distribute it to the world. So when you want to hook it up to iTunes, Spotify, or iHeart, then those places, iTunes, will go to your hosting company to get your podcast. So you have to have some place to host it, and you can't really host it at your computer, or because, what if your computer goes down, then it can't get your file and stuff like that. So, you want a hosting company that has the storage and has the capacity to do that. And there's a lot of different ones. I don't really want to name it because it changes all the time. Just Google hosting for podcasts and they'll come up with different recommendations. And really it all comes down to price and features. I wouldn't say there's one better than the other. It's just what price do you want, how much storage it has, the other features that you're looking for. You just have to do your research and find one that fits your needs. But I wouldn't say like one is horrible or one is better. My only recommendation, and this is personal, is an old saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So there are free hosting platforms out there, but I'm not a big fan of free just because there's a lot of underlying rules. You know, maybe whatever you record is their property and stuff like that. And what if you get big and they can make these random changes and different things like that because you're not paying for it? They have a lot more control. Whereas if you're paying for it, you have more control and they're not trying to get money other ways, because if you're not paying for it, they have to find money other ways to do that. And that could be some other things that you may not agree with. But to get your podcast on an iTunes, Spotify, or stuff like that, a lot of the hosting platforms will pretty much do it automatically for you. I like to reach out to all of them. And if you just type in podcast on iTunes, podcast on Spotify, something will pop up and it'll walk you through the steps. Like I said, I like to learn those fundamentals yourself because some of the hosting platforms speak on your behalf. So, and then when you have a problem or something like that, you have to go through your hosting platform to get to iTunes instead of you going straight to iTunes. And that could be a little convoluted. So if you just go straight to iTunes yourself, then, you know, there's no middleman in between if there's any issues. So that's why I prefer to just reach out to them myself than have the hosting platform automatically do it. But if you're okay with that, then yeah, a lot of them just make it simple, stupid. All you do is say, I want it on iTunes, check a box. And then there's certain things like you have to have like artwork and a description and a few other things, but they'll walk you through it and tell you what you need. And you just kind of plug that in and then they'll handle the rest. And they'll let you know in like a couple days, oh, you've been approved, or no, you haven't because of such and such.
And this seems like it's a little bit off topic, but I also asked Derrick, does a podcast need a logo?
You will need some type of artwork or logo for your podcast because a lot of like the iTunes and everything, they want a logo. It's mandatory and you have to put it in a certain size, but that's a whole nother story. You do need that logo for that, but it doesn't have to be very involved. I know for my first podcast, I made my own logo and just kind of did it from an app and that was it. But then for my second podcast, I actually paid someone to do the artwork, an actual artist, and he put it together for me. Like I said before, Fiverr is a really good place where if you just want someone to do, just type in podcast artwork or podcast logo, and someone will do it for you based off a certain price. Like I said, you can go from $5 to $100 depending on what you're looking for. But really, it doesn't have to be anything too crazy or outlandish. You could just do something in like Word or Paint, Microsoft Paint or whatever, if you're good with that. It doesn't take a whole lot. The thing is that really the first thing that people are going to see is your logo and then your description. So you want to make those as eye-catching as possible because usually those two things are the reason why someone's going to say, I want to listen to it. So if you don't catch their eye, they could skip over it. So that is the downfall of doing it yourself or kind of not really putting any effort into it. So, but you do have to have one. It just doesn't have to be great quality, but then that's subjective of, you know, will people still click to listen if it's not eye-catching?
Okay, so we need a logo, and you'll see why I asked that question here in a second. This part of the episode might be a little boring, so feel free to jump ahead to the next episode if I lose your interest here. But I'm actually going to go through the steps that it takes to actually launch a new podcast, which may reveal some of the things that we need to have in order to get started. Okay, so the hosting platform that I use is called Spreaker, and I'm not recommending that one. It works just fine. I don't have a lot of opinion on whether it's good or bad, and I really haven't used another one, so I don't have anything to compare it to. So I'm going to my podcasts, and one of the options is to create a new podcast, and that's what I'm going to do here. In the first line, it's going to ask me what the title of the podcast is. I'm going to create a new one, the Great Big Intergalactic Search for Good Podcasts, which is too long, so I'm going to shorten it to TGBI SF GP. All right, so we've got the title, and it asks me what the language is, and it's going to be English. And then it's going to ask me for a category. And sometimes I really don't like the options on all these things. There's so many of them, but even then it's a stretch to choose one. Like a lot of the options here, I'm going to read just some of them. Arts, business, education, comedy, fiction, government, health and fitness, history, kids and family, music, news, religion and spirituality, science, society and culture, sports, technology, true crime, TV and film. And if you've listened to the Great Big Intergalactic at all, I'm all over the place. So I wouldn't even know what category to use for something like that. I think I ended up using journaling because it was an extension of my journal, which might actually be a bad category for me to be in. So I would put some thought into that ahead of time. Maybe look at the options. But for this one, I'm just going to go to education and how to. All right. And then it's going to ask me for artwork, a logo, which is why I asked Derrick about logos earlier in this podcast. I haven't really made one, but Spreaker tells me we recommend uploading artwork of at least 1400 by 1400 pixels and a maximum of 512 kilobytes. We support JPEG, PNG, GIF or GIF, whatever you want to call that, and TIFF formats. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't know how to make a logo. But I can tell you, as somebody who is a former graphic designer of many years, I used to do a lot of this kind of thing, and it doesn't have to be complicated or flashy to be good. In fact, when I created the Great Big Intergalactic logo, which you can look at by either looking at the logo of this podcast or going to my social media, you'll see that it's very, very, very simple. And in the past, when I did graphic design, I probably would have had Photoshop at my disposal, but I didn't for this one. And not only that, but I was kind of in a hurry to get the logo. I didn't want to really think about it much. So I either went to, I don't even remember which one I used, either Paint or GIMP. Both are free. Paint comes with PCs and it's not great. And GIMP's not great either, but you can download that for free as well. And you can do something with either of those programs pretty easily that turns out to be relatively good quality, as long as it doesn't need to be complicated. And as you can tell from my logo, I did it as simply as possible. It's just 4 words, the Great Big Intergalactic. I didn't use any capitals. I used like a bright green over a dark background. And I thought, well, I'll come back later and fix it when I have Photoshop in front of me. The simplicity that I made through GIMP or Paint or whatever I did, I thought it actually worked really well. So after I created it, I really didn't want to go back and change it because honestly, I just like the simplicity. It didn't need to be that complicated. But there are some great ones out there. I think Derrick spoke about how he went and had somebody kind of create some graphics for his podcast, which is a really great idea too. I mean, if you have a little extra spending money, why not go out and make a great first impression by having a really kick-butt logo? But remember, it has to be 1400 by 1400 pixels, and there's a reason for that as well. And it's not just for quality graphics. And so it's going to ask me to upload a new image. So I'm going to go to Paint real quick. Actually, I'm going to go see if I have GIMP. And I don't. So I'm just going to use Paint. I'm going to go to File, New. And I'm going to go to Home. And one of the options in the Home tab is Resize. So I'm going to go to Resize. And then it's going to ask me what I want the pixels to be. So I'm going to go 1400. And then I have to make sure that I don't maintain the aspect ratio. So I unclick that box. So I'm going to make it 1400 by 1400. And I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to zoom all the way out. I'm going to choose black. And I'm going to choose the paint bucket, and I'm going to make the entire background black. You can do it however you want, whatever your favorite colors are. And then I'm going to go to orange, and I'm going to choose the A, which is the letter tool. I'm going to call this TGBISFGP. When it asks me for the size, I'm going to make it 140. I'm not sure what 140 watts, but I should know that as a former graphic designer. And I'm going to put it in the center of the box, of the 1400 square pixel box. So it says TGBI SFGP in bright yellow letters around a dark black box. And I'm going to save it. And it's very simple, just like the original logo. All right, I saved it to the desktop or to my folder, whichever, depending on how organized you are. I'm going to go in and I'm going to upload the new image into Spreaker on the Spreaker website. And it's asked me for the visibility, and it's going to be public. And then it asked me for a description. And I'm not going to think too much about this for now, just because we're doing this as an example. But I said TGBISFGP, or the Great Big Intergalactic Search for Good Podcasts, is a show about podcasts. Thrilling description, isn't it? And it's going to ask me for my email address. And it says the email address allows you to confirm the ownerships into platforms like Spotify and Google Podcasts. And so I'm going to put my email address in there. And I'm going to click create. And I have a new podcast. That easy. And then it's going to ask me to upload episodes. And I'm going to go and I'm going to upload the first episode of How to Start a Podcast, just because I don't have anything else. All right, and I uploaded it. And that takes a few minutes to actually upload. And so my options are collaborations. Let me click on that and see what that is. I don't want to add a collaborator. Edit info, but that's the stuff that I've already done. I don't need to edit that again. Distribution, that one's important. So it's telling me, find new listeners by distributing your podcast to all the major listening platforms. You'll be able to measure the results from statistic pages and monetize your podcast wherever it's listened to. So I'm looking at my options here, and here they are. Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Facebook Podcasts. I don't remember seeing that one before. Amazon Music, Audible, Castbox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, and GeoSavan or something like that. I don't even know what that is. And I think Derrick spoke earlier about doing this differently in a way where he can access the platforms directly and not go through Spreaker or whatever platform you're using. I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to, so if you have questions, message him at Hindsight. So when I click on Apple Podcasts, it asks me to submit, but it tells me that the requirements that I have to have at least one public episode, which I already did. So I reviewed that, and I'm going to press OK. Then I'm going to go to Spotify and submit that one. And again, the requirements for that one is to have at least one public episode available, and I do. And then I'm going to go to iHeartRadio, and I submitted that. And so this one tells me a little bit different. I have to have the one public episode, and then the last episode has to be less than 2 weeks old. And I just created it, so we're good there. So I press OK. I go to Google Podcasts. I submit there, and it's the same one public episode. Facebook Podcast. I've never seen this one before. Connect, it says. And you have to be connected to whatever Facebook site you use. I would probably recommend having a specific, I don't know. I guess this is up to you. I have a specific Facebook site for my podcast. And I have a specific Facebook profile for my podcast. So it's asking me to continue as Caesar. Oh, this one's complicated. It says, below is a list of podcast eligible pages you own. Please select which pages Spreaker can link your podcast to. Note that pages that are not eligible to link to your podcast are disabled. I'm going to press next. What is Spreaker allowed to do? It says, manage podcasts on your pages. Yes. Create and manage content on your page. Yes. Read content posted on the page. Yes. Show a list of the pages you manage. I don't know what any of that means. If I were smarter, I'd think about that more, but I'm not. Amazon Music, same. Castbox, same. Deezer, same. Podcast Addict, same. Podchaser, same requirements. And GeoSavan, whatever that is, same requirements. So I press OK on all of those, and I submit. And then it gives me options for statistics, and I pay for the basic service, so I don't have like the more interesting stats like how long people listened and where the people listened from. I think if you pay for more, you can figure out where your listeners are coming from. I don't happen to care that much. There may be a day when, if I'm ever getting advertising or whatever, that might be worth it for me to know. But for now, this is a hobby, and as long as this is just a hobby, I'm going to not care that much about some things, including where my listeners are coming from and how long they're listening. For now, all I care about is creating good content and being happy with the product that I make. Oh, when you first do this, and I think I've made this mistake, and I'm not sure if there's a way to fix it, it told me to make a data profile. And my first podcast was called the Cleveland Podcast. And that was really at the time the only podcast that I really wanted to do. Don't name your data profile the same thing as your podcast. And I'm like, why not? Because this is the only podcast I'm ever going to make. Well, 2 years later, I want to make another podcast. And when I go to share my current podcast, the Great Big Intergalactic, sometimes when I go to get the link and I share it with people, the link says the Cleveland Podcast. And I'm not sure exactly how to fix that. But in hindsight, if I had this to do all over again, I would create a very benign, very boring, nondescript name for my podcast network. Like, I don't know, TCPN is what I call it now, which is, short for the Cleveland Podcast Network, which is silly in its own right because the Cleveland Podcast is dead. I haven't made an episode in months, and there probably won't be another one. And yet, when I go to share the Great Big Intergalactic, it says the Cleveland Podcast in the URL if I don't share it correctly. There are ways to get around that, but it's annoying. I just wish I would have done it right the first time. So be creative and think about this in advance. What do you want to name your network? So let's say for now you want to make a podcast about armadillos. Well, maybe in 2 years, you'll be tired of armadillos and you'll want to talk about aardvarks. So keep that in mind as you name your network. That's one of the few things I regret, is not naming my network correctly. If anybody's listening and they use Spreaker and they know how to change that, please write to me and I'd be very grateful. Congratulations to me. I have a new podcast, which I'm probably going to delete in a few minutes. But that's it. I would like to thank Derrick and Andrew and Isaac for joining us for this episode. Sorry to be so boring at the end there. The next episode's probably going to be like this too, where I dig into the weeds a little bit. But thank you for joining us. Real quick, you can find Derrick at hindsight101media.com or check out his YouTube DIY channel on YouTube. You can find Andrew at trackeditprint.com, and you can search for Isaac at the Biologic Podcast. I'm guessing wherever podcasts can be found. All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody, again, and hope to see you on the next episode. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com, TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic, or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.